Hi, Adams. Happy Friday. Hope you had a great week. I'm here with chapter 16 of Beyond the Bright Sea. Oh, my hair's looking crazy today. All right. Chapter 16. I was relieved when we sailed into Pennakees Harbor and saw no boat at the pier. We hadn't seen one sailing nearby either, so I'd expected we'd have the place to ourselves. For a while, at least. The Birdman hasn't come back then, I said. Osh said not yet. He climbed out of the skiff and offered a hand to Miss Maggie, who surprised me by taking it. I followed, and we pulled the boat up on the sand. So here we are, Osh said. Now what? We find out what made that thump. I didn't come for the thump, he said. I came for woad-waxin'. He'd brought a canvas sack this time. I'll help with that, Miss Maggie said. You go on, Crow. We'll see you there. But any sign of that man, and you come back, Osh said. I promised I would, and I meant it. The Birdman was a scary fellow, and I had no intention of meeting up with him again. I started off walking, but soon was running down the old grassy lane, up and over the hills at speed fueled by a strong mix of curiosity, a little fear, and what my legs wanted. In no time at all, I was at the hospital, Miss Maggie and Osh still foraging in the distance. I climbed the steps to the porch and knocked on the big door, softly at first, and then harder. Again, from somewhere inside, a noise. This time, a series of small thumps, like someone was knocking in return. This time, the door was not locked. I pushed it open. Hello, I called. Hello? From above, I heard the knocking sound again, and something else, a muffled growling. I pictured a huge dog, hungry for someone like me to open a door and set it free. I thought about waiting for Osh and Miss Maggie. I turned to go back into the yard until they arrived, but then I heard a bigger thump and something breaking, and I hurried to the hospital and up the front steps without another thought. Hello, I called as I climbed. The knocking sound drew me toward a long hallway, all its doors closed. I opened the first one to find nothing but an old bed frame and a small table topped with a washbowl and pitcher. I stood in the hallway listening and then crept past the next two doors to where the knocking was the loudest. I admit that I was scared as I reached for the knob, and I was scared as I slowly pushed the door open, and I was scared when I saw who was waiting for me inside, though more for him than for myself. There on the floor was a man rolled up in a bedsheet from his chin to his ankles and tied tight in a rope. His mouth was stuffed full of rag tied in place with a kerchief, so all it could do was growl and moan. Only his feet were free to move at all. It was his boot, its hard edge tapping on the floor, that I heard from below. Beside him were an overturned table and a broken pitcher. When he saw me in the doorway, he closed his eyes and went limp and quiet, but for a pitiful sob deep in his throat. I removed the gag first as quickly as I could and threw it aside. The man began to cry properly when I did, gasping and sobbing so hard that I couldn't understand a word he was saying. I realized that I was talking too, as I tried to free him. It's all right now, I said over and over again. It's all right now, mister. It's all right now. I don't know you, he stammered as I worked on the knots in the rope. Where is he? Is he gone? He's not here, I said. I'm Crow, and I'm going to get you out of here. The sheet was filthy, soaked with all the things a body does, and the stench in the room was terrible. I pulled apart the knots in the rope that bound him and rolled him gently until he was free of the sheet and could finally move, which he did slowly and carefully after being bound for days. I stood back and watched him work the blood into his arms and legs, flex his fingers, crane his neck this way and that, crying all the while. He was a small man, thin, with a sharp nose like a bird. You're the bird keeper, I said. He quieted down at that, rubbing his face with his hands and sighing again and again. I am, he said, his voice hoarse. Would you please step out for a moment, please? I wonder, would you step out, please? And he began to cry again, but less urgently. I went back into the hallway and closed the door behind me. After a bit, he opened it again and stood there, wrapped in a blanket, his clothes on the floor in a heap behind him. Are you, I began, but he held up one hand and edged past me down the hallway and then the stairs as I followed, out through the door and across the yard, faster and faster over the edge of the bluff as I watched across the rocky beach. falling twice but scrambling again to his feet, shedding the blanket as he went and straight into the sea. I followed him, gathering up the blanket and shaking it clean, while he splashed madly in the waves and then sat in the shallows, scrubbing himself with wet sand head to toe. Then he slowly rolled onto his knees and worked his way carefully to his feet, covering his private parts with his hands. He was terribly thin and pale. Blood from his falls trickled down his wet legs, one knee already swelling. I handed him the blanket and turned my back. Grab hold of my shoulder, I said. I'll go slowly. His hand felt like a claw. Several times as we made our way over the rocks, he nearly fell, and I know I'd had bruises on my shoulder from his grip. I heard Osh calling my name, and I called back, "Here!" as loudly as I could. But when the gamekeeper gasped and began to tremble, I said, "It's all right. That's Osh. That's just Osh." But he refused to take another step until Osh and Miss Maggie appeared at the top of the bluff. When they saw us among the rocks below, they hurried down, Osh taking the gamekeeper in his arms and carrying him like a child into the soft sand at the foot of the bluff, where he laid him down. Miss Maggie dropped to her knees beside him and tucked the blanket around the man, who was shivering, though the day was warm. "My lord, you're nothing but skin and bones," she said, pulling off her hat and tucking it beneath his head. "What happened to you?" Osh stood tall above us, watching and listening. Ugh, sorry guys, allergies. I kept one eye on the bay and another on the man's face as he slowly began to collect himself and eventually said, "I'm Sloane, the gamekeeper." "You're the gamekeeper? Not that other man?" Osh said. Mr. Sloane shook his head. "Last time I sailed to New Bedford for supplies, a man at the wharf asked me for a lift to Cuttyhunk. He said he was a pilot coming over for work, and I thought nothing of it. Didn't mind the extra mile to drop him there before coming home. Thought I'd stop at the inn for a meal and some company." He stopped and sat up, the sand making his wet hair white. Pulled the blanket tighter around his shoulders and drew a long, shaky breath. "But when we were halfway across the bay, he told me he wanted to go to Penikese instead. Said he had some business there, which made me laugh." "What business?" I asked him. "There's no business on Penikese but birds and rabbits." To which he said I could either take him here or he'd throw me into the bay and leave me to drown. Mr. Sloane shook his head sadly. "I'm not a big person or young anymore, and I can't swim a lick, so I brought him to Penikese. God forgive me, I'm sure I would have, though, if I'd known how long he'd keep me locked up while he did. I don't know what. I don't understand what he was doing here, or why he had to pen me up like that. For what?" "We don't know," Miss Maggie said. "Or why he tied and gagged me every time he went out anywhere," he continued, as if she hadn't said anything. "I ask you," and here he looked at each of us in turn, "where was I going to run to, and who was I going to call me? Who was going to hear me call?" "We would have," I said, "when we were here for the first time." "That was you?" he asked, "then too?" Maggie nodded. "We sailed over from Cuttyhunk. We had business of our own." Mr. Sloane sighed. "I heard you knocking. I was tied to a chair and I tipped it over to make some noise, hoping you would hear me." Miss Maggie looked at Osh, and then he at her. "She heard you," Maggie said, nodding at me, "but that man came just then and ran us off. I'm sorry we didn't come back sooner." Mr. Sloane shook his head. "No, it's better that you didn't. He was different after that, worse and angry. No telling what he would have done if you'd come back." He worked his way to his feet. "If you don't mind, could we maybe go somewhere else now?" He looked around fearfully and began to stagger up the bluff. "I have some clean clothes in the hospital, but there's nothing else I need as much to be off this island before he comes back." Osh helped me to the hospital, and we waited outside while he went in alone. It took him no time at all to dress himself and pack his bag and join us again in the yard. He looked better in clean clothes, though some blood was seeping through at the knee and his hair was still wild with sand and salt. "I owe you a debt," he said. "I would have died here if you hadn't come." Miss Maggie ran a hand over my head. "You can thank this one," she said. "She's the reason we came back." "And I will," said Mr. Sloane. "You just tell me how, and I will." "On Cuttyhunk," Osh said, turning toward the harbor. "Time to go." But I had one more thing to do first. "I'll catch up with you," I said. "I just want to look at the cottages for a minute, that's all." Osh nodded, and Miss Maggie said, "For a minute, but no more, and then you come along." What's there that you want? Mr. Sloane said. Those old shacks are empty, and not a thing left in them. But he turned without waiting for an answer and followed Osh and Maggie down the lane. The first cottage was just as Mr. Sloane had said, empty. No furniture, no curtains, even the stove was gone. Nothing left but a hole in the ceiling where the pipe had been. Worse, someone had pulled up the floorboards so nothing remained except the frame. I imagined they'd gone to feed the big fires that had burned outside the hospital. For roasting geese, I had supposed. Beneath where the floor had been, the dirt was all dug up. More holes. I closed the door behind me and headed for the next cottage. Like the first, this one had no furniture or floor, and as before, the ground was all holes and mounds of loose dirt. I wondered what he had been digging for, and whether he had found it. This time, I carefully stepped between the holes and made my way around the cottage, looking for whatever wanted to be found. If I hadn't, I wouldn't have seen what was carved on the wall in one corner, just level with my eyes. Another lamb. Beside it, someone had carved something else. A feather. I remembered the ruined letter that had been stuck to my tiny chest. It's lamb's. Its little feather. I heard Osh calling for me in the distance. I ran my fingers over the lamb. It was no bigger than my hand, and the feather no bigger than my finger. Coming! I yelled back. I left the cottage and took off at a run, down the lane and straight to where the others waited for me, all of us eager to be going now. I did not know what I was leaving behind, still undiscovered, or what else was waiting across the water on the mainland. All right. I want to know, what do you think was once in those cottages? And why was he digging? Why was that man digging in those cottages? What was he looking for? I hope you guys have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you back here on Monday. Bye, Adams.